Welcome to Antarctic Stories, a podcast that takes you behind the scenes into the rich world of people who live, work, and undertake daring expeditions in the polar regions. My name is Heather Thorkelson, and I'll be your host today. Today on the podcast, I speak with Paul Hart. Perhaps best known for his adventure travel writing for the Telegraph newspaper in the UK, Paul Hart's career is somewhat more eclectic and comprehensive than its simple label might belie. With an impressive military background of 30 years of service both in the Army and then the Royal Navy, including with the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines Commandos, Paul's rich career profile has provided him with a unique perspective on how to develop the physical and mental strength necessary to be resilient when faced with challenging situations. In the military, and now in the civilian street, Paul has always been an avid expedition leader, leading groups across the globe from the polar regions to the Himalayas, from Alaska to the jungle. As part of those journeys of discovery, Paul has had to learn an awful lot about himself and how to work effectively within a team, including when leading the team in seriously challenging environments and life-threatening situations. He has worked in some of the most extreme conditions imaginable and survived some calamitous events. These include being avalanched, being blown off a Himalayan ridge, being capsized in mountainous seas off the coast of Alaska, and having his yacht come apart beneath him in the storms of the Bay of Biscay. As a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, Paul regularly travels on expeditions that have an exploration and scientific basis. In 2012, he led a small team on the first crossing of the Antarctic Peninsula by manhaul to conduct cutting-edge science. This project was in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of his boyhood hero and fellow naval officer, Captain Robert Falcon Scott, reaching the South Pole. This cross-peninsula project drew on Paul's original science degree in oceanography, meteorology, and geology from Plymouth University, and was focused on providing evidence behind why the Antarctic Peninsula is the fastest warming part of the planet. This trip and the desire to educate people about the changes in the polar regions, as well as the legacy of Scott's leadership and contribution to science, saw Paul team up with fellow former Navy colleague Anthony Ginman as part of an educational outreach program for schools and colleges. Paul is a great believer in self-determination and taking responsibility for one's own life choices. He bases his approach to life upon the words written in a cross above Captain Scott's final resting place: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. From Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Well, hot on the tail of that amazing biography, I am so pleased to welcome you, Paul Hart, to the Antarctic Stories podcast.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And where are we talking to you from?
So I'm in my home in Plymouth. I'm in the naval port where obviously Shackleton and Scott have passed through, sailed from, etc. In fact, I live maybe no more than half a mile from where Scott was brought up as a boy.
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a really nice connection.
Yeah.
Is that where you're originally from?
No. I came down here many years ago. I was born in Manchester. I spent my early years in Manchester, but I couldn't settle in the city. I was always kind of had itchy feet, and so myself and my brothers used to get on our bikes and cycle out to the Peak District and the Pennines just to get away from being in the city centre. And then we would sometimes sleep out in the caves there, and then my mum would want to send the police to collect us, but my father would try to dissuade her.
That's great. So you've always had that in you, obviously. And I mean, from your biography, we can see you carried through that exploratory nature into your adult years and really went out and saw a lot of the world and have done a lot of quite interesting things. And so there are many different adventures that we could talk about today, but what I really want to focus on is your 2012 crossing of the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, what specifically gave you the idea to cross over the peninsula?
Oh, it was a combination of factors, to be honest. I was in the Royal Navy at the time, and it was obviously the anniversary of Captain Scott reaching the South Pole in 2012 on the 17th of January. And it was the 100th anniversary, and the Navy were interested in doing a commemorative activity around Scott. He'd always been a boyhood hero of mine, and I was looking to do something as well. So those two things combined, because I was actually involved in the world of adventurous training in the Navy at the time. And then there was a tri-service expedition looking to go and do mountaineering. So we brought those three things together. The big expedition to do the mountaineering was run by Colonel Paul Edwards, who's a good friend of mine. And I made the suggestion that we'd then go and do with a small team something to commemorate Scott. Originally, we were going to walk down the spine of Antarctica, but then when we discussed doing something around science, which is where Scott had obviously come from, and that memory of Scott, talking to things like the British Antarctic Survey and the Scott Polar Research Institute and various other universities, including the National Environmental Research Council, the thing that they couldn't do was cross the peninsula to do some work that they really wanted to get data for. And so out of that came my expedition, which was to go from the west coast to the east coast and back again, collecting data for these various research organizations.
Oh my goodness. So basically over a huge mountain range that had never been done before.
Certainly not by manhaul. And Wally Herbert, who has spent a lot of time in that area in using dogs, he was mostly on the Larsen ice shelf. So his track involved staying away from the mountain ranges. And one of the big things is certainly with the warming of that part of the world, the barriers that would have held back the glaciers coming down from the high plateau areas, they've largely gone. So the movement of ice off the plateau is far faster, which creates far more crevasses. So that was the reason that people weren't doing it, because of the incredible risk with crevasse.
But then you and your partner, Anthony, thought, we'll just take a stab.
Anthony and I, it was a combined project. And actually, I was working with Anthony trying to get all of the descendants of Scott's party to the point where the tent had been folded down over Scott's body to do a commemoration ceremony. So one of the aspects was Anthony was going to take, my friend Anthony Jimman was going to take that group of individuals, and we were going to try and use the Royal Navy icebreaker and take the families down to do the commemoration ceremony with a Royal Navy chaplain and do sort of a fitting ceremony for Scott. And then we were going to do something in the spirit of Scott. So lots of people were going to the South Pole, with it being the 100th anniversary. But we kind of thought if you'd asked Scott what he wanted to do, he'd have said, let's go and do something that nobody else has done before, where nobody else has gone before, and do some science. So that's how my expedition project came about. We sort of put ourselves into the mind of Scott. Hence, we were going to do the peninsula and cross the peninsula, and Anthony was going to take the families to the grave site for Scott and conduct a ceremony there. But unfortunately, through one thing and another, and the Royal Navy ship not being available, that part of Anthony's project wasn't able to go ahead. So we combined everything into just my project of going across the peninsula.
How long and what is involved in the planning for a project like this? I mean, you can't just take a Qantas down to the peninsula and step off. And
looking back now, it was probably the biggest planning of any expedition I've ever done, and that includes even the ones of kayaking around the outside coastline of Alaska and first ascents in the Himalayas. We started in 2009, and I went to climb Makalu in 2010, knowing that I was going to come back and carry on going forward with the expedition to Antarctica in 2012. So from 2009 onwards, we started the planning, and the planning and obviously gaining financial support, they go hand in hand. And myself and Paul Edwards put out the combined services that we were going to do this expedition, and we looked for basically people who wanted to join us, and we were inundated. We had over 400 applicants. We knew we were going to take 24, and really people self-selected themselves out of the expedition because the commitment was so high. We trained pretty much twice a month at weekends. So over that period, every other weekend, we brought people together to do some training. And then we had camps where we would take people, we took them into Les Écrins in the Alps to test our crevasse rescue skills and so on. And it was highly demanding. And we had a whole matrix of skill sets that people had to become competent in order to join us down there. And eventually, after, I would say, 2.5 years of doing that, we had a team that we knew people would be capable and competent, and also they would be confident to operate in the area, and they would trust teammates around them. But we were left with about 40 people in the end. And from that, we then had to select 24, which was a really hard thing to do.
Wow, I can imagine. That is a really long process. So from 2009 to 2012, and a huge commitment for all the different people involved that were interested in joining, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, many of them were, fully operational. So they were having to find time to come back from whatever they were doing and meet. And quite often we would ask them to self-fund. So they would pay their own way to attend the training activities. It was a real commitment for everybody. And I had 3 children, 3 young children at the time. So, I was going through the process of not seeing them every other weekend. So it was highly demanding for everybody who went.
And what does the actual arrival at the location, at your starting location, look like? Who do you get involved in that? Who drops you off? Who picks you up? That kind of thing.
Well, we had various ideas about how to get to where we wanted to land. And originally we wanted to land at a place called Orford Cliff, because it had been ice-free at that time of year for as long as they'd had records. We worked around a sort of double-pronged attack. We looked at getting the Navy to take us down, but there were no ships available. And then eventually it boiled down to us hiring a yacht called Australis. And also, because we were doing work for the Antarctic Survey, British Antarctic Survey, we actually purchased seats on their flights. Which is interesting. We were doing work for them, and yet we had to pay for seats on their flights. But they were very kind. I mean, they were absolutely fantastic. So the idea was that we would drop off 12 because Australis could only take 12. Another 12 would fly into the base at Rothera, which is the British Antarctic Survey base. And then the yacht would go around and pick those 12 up and come back and drop those 12 off at Orford Cliff, and would combine the teams there. As it was, as we were flying across, we realised that for the first time in as many years as records had been taken, there was no access to Orford Cliff because sea ice was extending right out up to 35 miles offshore, particularly cold conditions that year, in spite of the sort of the global warming theme. And we ended up having to, we dropped off 12 at the Rothera base, and then I managed to get the British Antarctic Survey to fly me around looking for leads through the ice, which we then guided the yacht into the Rothera base. And we combined at the Rothera base, and then we borrowed one of their planes to go and fly and try and find somewhere else where we could land. Now, all of our planning had been around landing at Orford Cliff, and all of our flights over with satellites and so on, and the maps we'd made had all been around using Orford Cliff as a starting point. Then suddenly we were having to go quite a long way further south than that, and we had no maps for that area. So, quite literally, just like Scott, we were going into the unknown because we had no idea.
Oh my goodness. Talk about throwing a wrench in the wheel. That is bananas. And also, even if you had a plan B, let's say, even if you anticipated that there might be issues accessing your first point, you would have no way of knowing, and a lot of people wouldn't realize this, but things are so unpredictable. The ice, the sea ice, and everything is so unpredictable from year to year. And so even if you had a plan B and a different starting point, even that might have been inaccessible, right? And then what?
Well, absolutely. And even at Orford Cliff, with the overflights, we knew we would have to cross the very heavily crevassed areas of the glaciers, but that seemed to be one of the least crevassed. But literally from any point you want to land, as soon as you move away from the coast, understanding that the level of glaciation crevassing is so high means that there is no real route. You literally have to just find your way through. That was very much true of when we did land. We searched routes, and then we had to backtrack and go a different route and so on. And as an example, one of the mountaineering teams, they were on their second month of mountaineering, and they'd used this same route to go out from their camp and come back. And their tracks were on that route, and they thought they were completely safe. The very final day, they were coming back in, and literally, as they were coming back towards the camp, suddenly the guy on the front of the rope, a guy called Rob Tristram, very good friend of mine, disappeared from view and went down into a crevasse, and the rope cut all the way back to the second person in, and they were actually stood. They'd been using the bridge, the snow bridge, for a continuous period, just because of the way the conchoidal fractures had opened up. So they thought that all of the crevasses were coming in one direction. In fact, they were multiple fractures. So they then had the really quite hairy sort of activity of extracting rob from the glacier, from the crevasse, while being sat on the snow bridge and hoping it wouldn't collapse and they would all go down. And I have to say, their second team, because they worked in two groups of four, their second team had to go around and probe and find a way of actually getting rob out of the crevasse without disturbing anything, so that the rest of the team were safe. I mean, for them, that took an hour and a half to get rob out, and I think it was probably one of the most fraught periods for that group that you could imagine.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh my goodness. And so you're standing there facing this new potential route. You have no real knowledge of what's in front of you. These types of potential scenarios could very definitely happen. I mean, wow. Even with all of your experience, are you scared when you're undertaking something like this? I mean, whether you feel like you have a solid planned route or not, what's your relationship to fear in these scenarios?
I think you'd be untruthful or stupid to say that you don't have fear at any point. It's about taking that fear and using it. It's about being aware. So you just have to. And as I say, maybe in my younger days was probably one of those who so enjoyed the adrenaline rush, would do things which were right on the edge of being, I would just say, simply stupid. Because the risk was incredible, and having broken most of the bones in my body and had some quite serious I've been avalanched several times and so on. Those things happen because you're not taking proper care, and I can say that. Whereas in this instance, I had the team's safety was my responsibility. It was very much about making things happen the right way. And yes, we did take risks, but they were very calculated risks. And so I think there was a time, certain instances, I was crossing a crevasse because we had to cross the crevasse and snow bridge. I had a heavy, the sleds were weighing well over 100 kilos. I was the last man across. I'd watched the snow bridge compact and start to settle and begin to collapse. And there was a steep incline out of the snow bridge. And as I was going across, I could feel this thing beginning to go. And to say I wasn't frightened at that point, because I knew if I went in with the dynamics of the fall and the angle that the rest of the team were on, there might be a fairly strong chance we were all going to go in. But what could you do? You just simply take a large gulp and keep going. And
whew. Oh my goodness. So the obvious next question is then, what happens if something goes wrong? What's the backup plan? What's the rescue plan? Is there one? Who responds?
30 years ago, going around the outside coastline of Alaska, there was nobody coming to get us. We were on our own, and we would have to extract ourselves from whatever situation we found ourselves in. And the same was true in the Himalayas, because we didn't have all of the mobile connectivity that we have now. So you turned up, and so I remember, one of my first big mountains, a mountain called Tikha Parbat, Shikru Parbat. It was so far out of the way, there was no radio communications. We went in there, and we were there for 3.5 months, and nobody knew what had happened to us. So that's kind of how it used to be. And then the world has moved on. So now Lou Rudd, if anything had happened to him, he'd have operated his iridium beacon, and the services would have been there to pick him up. The thing is, in the peninsula, you don't have that. So there's no helicopters. The nearest helicopter is over 3,500 to 4,000 miles away. The ships are up in Chile. They don't take helicopters down generally. The British Antarctic Survey, they fly aircraft. Now, they might be able to land on the Larsen ice shelf. So if we'd have gone across the plateau over the top of the peninsula and down the other side with a casualty, we might have been able to get them onto the Larsen ice shelf. But even that would have been very, very challenging. And there we might have been able to get extracted. Other than that, it's very difficult to land a plane anywhere on the peninsula because of the mountains, because of the crevasses and so on. So we separated from the two other teams of 8, and my 8 went across the peninsula. We knew that we were going into the unknown, and if anything went wrong, we would have to manage our own extraction. There was always the backup plan that the other two teams would come and try and help us. But in short, if you're on the other side of the peninsula and somebody goes into a crevasse and breaks a femur, life-threatening situation, you've then got 3 people hauling one person with the other 4 trying to provide backup. But if then that sled goes into a crevasse, or another person goes into a crevasse, you've then got 2 and a sled with a person in a crevasse, and it all becomes that much more difficult. So I suppose in short, we would say that the backup plan was we were the backup plan.
There's not many places on Earth where you can say that's the case, but definitely where you were.
Yeah. It is unusual to say that now. I'm not sure the world of adventure is made better by it. I'm not sure that the whole communications thing has made the adventure world better, because it was quite, for me, it was quite special to be able to go into the unknown and be gone. And actually, you then came back with your story, as opposed to every day, your story is tweeted, so wherever you are, you can relay something via a satellite and the world knows what you're doing every moment. I quite like that mystical element of people in the old ways of the Royal Geographical Society, which I was a member of. You read their stories and they go off. And the way that they got information back was they had a runner. If they were in the Himalayas, they had a series of runners who would send a letter back, and that letter would come back and then be sent over telegraph. And so people would know 3 weeks in arrears of what was going on. Quite a, I suppose, quaint way, but I quite like that.
I suppose it put you in that position that was very similar to your idol, Scott, right? Like, off you went and you didn't hear anything until somebody made it back to tell you something. So really interesting stuff. So can you explain a little bit about why the team is separated into 3 groups of 8, and how are you operating? Like, are you going in waves? I mean, I think probably most people don't understand how you plan that type of expedition with different groups.
Specifically, the original expedition was around mountaineering, and so it was going to be mountaineering on the coast. It wasn't designed around going across the peninsula. So the Scott side of it became the crossing of the peninsula, while 2 other teams of 8 did their mountaineering activities. Now, those 2 other teams were there to some extent to provide backup for us in case of a problem. So if I'd have had an injury early on, or somebody had been ill when we arrived, I could have switched somebody out of my team into one of the other teams. So I knew I needed 8 in 2 ropes of 4. So if you can imagine, we were all on skis, we were all hauling a sled, we were all tied together, because if you go into a crevasse with a 100-kilo sled, you have to stop the sled first, because if the sled goes past you, attached to you, it's going to do you some damage. So we developed a routine by which the rope would hold the sled first and then would hold the person who was hauling the sled afterwards. The person would then extract themselves from the sled. We would then extract the person, and then we would extract the sled. So it's quite a complicated business, and we worked out the mechanism of doing it. And the best way of doing that was by having 4 people on a rope and 2 ropes of 4. So that if you did get the instance of where 4 people, for some reason, went into a crevasse and they landed on a snow bridge, and they would undoubtedly have been casualties, we had the other 4 then who could try and find some way of extracting them and hauling them back and so on. Any more than 8, it becomes unwieldy in terms of management and group control and so on. So 8 became the ideal number for us as a crossing the Antarctic Peninsula. And then mountaineering teams, it was great that they could operate again in 2 teams of 4 doing their mountaineering, because then one team would back up the next team.
Hearing you talk about the potential of, a whole team of 4 going into a crevasse makes me wonder, what was the sketchiest moment that you felt on that particular expedition? What was the moment where you thought, oh, everything's going sideways? Did anyone get hurt?
Every day. It was a pretty standard day to be in difficulty. The weather was unbelievable, and the scientists, the Basque scientists, had told me that on the peninsula, as you head up towards the top, you will have a dump of snow. You can have a dump of snow in excess of 1 meter in 24 hours.
Oh my gosh!
So we were in this constant game of trying to work out the best way of having the tents, and there's 2 main things that stick out in my mind, as I look back. One of them was being simultaneously avalanched while one of the team went into a crevasse, which made life really challenging and unnerved everybody in the team, because having been avalanched and the person having gone into the crevasse, we managed to extract the person from the crevasse, and we thought, well, actually, there can't be another avalanche here. It was such a big avalanche; it actually travelled uphill to hit us. So we'll just coalesce for the moment. We'll get some brews on. We'll put the tents up, and we'll stay here now. Make sure everybody's calmed down. And we got the tents up. We got settled. We were in the tent, and then all of a sudden we heard another avalanche go. And I was thinking, we've got to be really unlucky to be hit again. And literally, I thought, that's coming towards us. And I stuck my head out of the tent and could see the avalanche coming. And there was no way we were going to get away. We were all in the tent. So I just said, it's either going to bury us or it's just going to give us a dusting. We'll just have to wait and see. And it was as simple as that. And we sat there, and the avalanche roared towards us, and we heard suddenly the tent went flat over us, and there was a big sort of the noise and the kerfuffle, and we knew the snow was landing on top. And then the tent popped itself back up. Hillybergs, absolutely fantastic pieces of kit. And we were only part buried, you know. So, but all those moments of the avalanche coming towards us after what had just happened were really unnerving.
Oh, I can't imagine.
So that was one of the worst moments. But I think for me personally was we settled in on the 17th of January, which was the night of the 16th of January, the 24 hours of daylight. And we were going to do a commemoration to Scott on the 17th of January. And obviously Scott had suffered atrocious weather on the way back. He'd effectively had winter conditions, Antarctic winter conditions on his return journey. And then, you know, they're labelled as the worst, as a 100-year event, the worst weather conditions in 100 years. Following in the spirit of Scott, we probably had the worst weather conditions they'd had in another 100 years. We woke up and literally there was the sound. I thought it sounded just like a juggernaut roaring down on us. And the next minute we were in this storm of ferocity, which I've experienced nothing like it, not even in the Himalayas, not even being at over 26,000 feet with the wind howling. You know, you're into the areas of the jet stream. There was nothing like this, and it just went on and on and on, and the tent was just continually flattened. It would come down in waves, the tent would flatten, and it would feel like somebody was trying to drive a juggernaut over the top of the tent.
Oh, my gosh.
And for me, we, with the team, it was the fact that the tents were beginning to struggle with the conditions, were beginning to become damaged by the conditions, i.e. the polings were being bent, etc. And so I said to the team, look, if the tent comes apart, there's only one thing to do, which is get into your sled, unzip the sled cover and climb into it, because nobody was going to survive outside in those conditions more than a few minutes. Mm-hmm. I mean, and we were being buried, just being buried. So that was the next thing. We'd build a block wall to protect us. The block wall was blown apart with the conditions. And everywhere where you then try and... So we knew block walls wouldn't work in the future, so we used to dig pits. But if you dig a pit, everything will dump into the area around the pit. And so we were in this constant battle of, you know, the tent being exposed to the wind and being ripped apart, or putting it into a pit and then the pit filling up. So those were... In about 30 days, we had 3 days where the conditions were not like that, where the conditions were, I call, benign.
Only 3 days.
In 30 days of, so in a 30-day period,
yeah.
I mean, we were on the peninsula for 2 months, but in a 30-day period, there were 3 days when we crossed the top of the plateau and went down the far side where the conditions were good. The rest of the time, the conditions were pretty appalling, to be honest.
When you think back on that, what's your sense? Do you think that was insane, or do you think, you know, I'm really proud that we did this, or maybe we should think twice before we do that again? Or like, what is your, having the benefit of hindsight in a few years to process how hardcore that was? How does it feel to you now?
It was quite challenging. It was challenging and it was demanding, and it was more than anything mentally unnerving, in that we were going further. As we crossed the peninsula, we knew we were going further away from help. And yet we were going into these kind of conditions. And after the avalanche, you know, the avalanche and the crevasse incident, the team were pretty unnerved. And I did say to them, look, you know, we are putting ourselves in further danger. I don't want to take sole responsibility for pushing people on. You know, what do you want to do? And every one of them said, we carry on, which for me was, it kind of showed just the bonding we had made as a team over those years of preparation, and how in that period of starting the crossing, we had formulated in our mind, we had a task to do, and we were going to do that task. And before I went, the first Sea Lord, I had my patron was the first Sea Lord, said to me, you do realise, Paul, 100th anniversary of Scott going into the unknown, and to many people, his detractors, they said he was on a foolhardy mission, he didn't plan properly, and he died and killed his team. So you've got two things. If this goes wrong, the press will turn around and say, look, 100 years on, another naval officer, ridiculous, doing the same thing, the Navy learned nothing, so they'll tear you apart. And the other thing is, if you turn around and come back, they'll go, well, look, the Navy people don't have the same metal as they had in Scott's day, so you're onto a no-win situation.
Yep.
Unless you get this done and you all come back safely. And that thought stuck in my mind throughout the trip. It was, we just need to do this, because otherwise the reputation of the Navy and Scott and everything else will just be sullied. So, we've got to do this right.
Yeah, absolutely. And how amazing that everybody on the team was 120% all in. That's
they were the team, fantastic group of individuals. Friends now. We were separated over the world. Some of them coming back for an expedition, which I'm planning in 2020. Top-notch people.
amazing. So I'm going to switch gears for a second, because there was an educational outreach program as part of this expedition to connect with schools and colleges. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you were able to share your experience or your discoveries with schools?
Yeah, so converse to what I was saying earlier about always being in contact with people, I think this is where the real benefit is. We used Anthony Jimman's educational platform, which is education through expeditions, and it links into schools so that school children can be updated as to what you're doing, but they can also ask questions, and we could pose questions for the school children for their projects. So in one instance, we set up a meter-high pole, and we gave people at midday the direction of the shadow of that pole and the height of that pole. And we asked the schools to calculate where we were, because you could use that to work out your latitude and longitude. For the younger schools, they were really interested in how you can ski up a hill. So we made little video podcasts of using skins and how a skin would work on a ski to allow you to go uphill. We talked about climate change. We talked about how snow forms. We were able to operate between both the primary and the secondary levels, both doing the science piece, but also doing the sort of human information piece, what it feels like to be in that environment, which is young people are really interested, especially the younger element, really interested to know, if you get some hot water and you throw it up, will it freeze before it lands on the ground? That's the thing. So, we used to take video and send them snaps of that. So it was all, and how long it would take for water for a cup of boiling water to freeze. So we would film it for them and then condense that film. Those are the great things, and Anthony's platform enabled us to do that. We reached out to several thousand schools, not just in the UK, but in the US and across Europe. So.
That's amazing. And what a phenomenal learning experience for them to be able to ask people who are in the field doing something so unusual, and getting those, as you say, like videos and finding coordinates and stuff. It just takes the learning to a completely different level. So that's really wonderful.
So every expedition I've been involved in since, or every activity, we've tried to do that. I was going to mention it at some point, but we take underprivileged children to Finnish Lapland, to Inari, to live with the Sami people, so that they're removed from their poverty background, and they're placed in a position where life is very different and they see the world very differently. But we get those children we take to communicate lessons learned back with the school, with their peers at school. And one of the best things I've ever seen is how young people, when you've educated them about something, they then explain it entirely differently to their compatriots. And they do it in terms that other children understand. So there was one little girl who, she wanted to know how the Aurora Borealis worked. And so I explained, the photon stream from the sun, etc., and energized particles. And so I did all this. And she was really, we talked to all the kids, but she was really interested. So I took a few moments longer to explain it to her. And then I said, well, why don't you talk to your school friends and tell them about it? So she made a little video of what was going on. And so she sat there and she drew this thing on the board, and she drew, it's like footballs coming from the sun. This big protective layer on the outside of Earth, and they get bounced around to the very top and the very bottom, and then they bang against each other, and it makes all this light come. They're just the way they did it. It was really unusual, but I think the children probably at home learned far more from her discussion than they would have ever got from me.
So what would you say is something that's sort of unique, in this vein of kids asking funny questions about things and sort of having a very creative approach to the knowledge that they want to gain? What's something unique to extreme polar expeditions that a regular person wouldn't imagine or anticipate?
I think it's the number one, the uniqueness of the environment, but also the pristineness of the environment. I think people, we sit 8,000 miles away from the Antarctic and 1,000 miles away from the Arctic, certainly in the UK. And we don't really experience snow that much in the UK. Maybe in Scotland a little bit, but not in the southern part of the UK. So we don't understand how snow makes everything suddenly go clean and how it creates a completely pristine environment. It's rare. Children don't understand that. But when you expose them to the fact that actually, if you move away from the coast and the peninsula, there's nothing. There's the only life form is a tiny gnat, and even that doesn't exist particularly far away from the coast. So you are totally alone. It's a place where, unlike the Himalayas, unlike the Sahara, you travel most places and you will encounter people. Even on the mountains, the big mountains now, there's lots of people on the mountains. But when you're in the Antarctic, you're away from everybody. You are truly on your own. And that's one of the psychological things which actually most people are unaware of. It's about when you are away from any other support mechanism in life. It's kind of a really grounding feeling. Some of my team, I noticed when we first landed and walked away from the coast, and we started that conversation, what happens if things go wrong? And we were talking about we have to extract ourselves. The sudden realization that there was nobody coming to help, that we were truly on our own, and this environment was what we were going to experience, but nobody had seen this. Nobody on the planet had seen the view that we were looking at. So it's very, very special. And I think that's what you can relay. And it's the same in the Arctic. There are places in the Arctic that people just don't go.
Yeah.
Especially now, going to the North Pole is so difficult. If you're going to do a step off the shore onto sea ice and make your way to the North Pole, it's so expensive, so difficult. It's just is great that actually people can understand, be shown what it's like to be on sea ice.
And you can count yourself as one of the very few people alive who has been to a place where nobody else has been, and probably nobody else will ever go.
It is a very special feeling, I have to say. There's a couple of places. So first, a sense of mountains where nobody had been before, but I'm certain that people will either go or have been to those mountains since, and will make a sense. The Himalayas is regularly visited, but the Antarctic Peninsula, it's not.
Paul, what are your plans for the future? I mean, obviously, you don't sound like the kind of guy who can slow down.
So lots and lots of plans. Big one at the moment, which I've got Foreign and Commonwealth Office approval for, and I'm engaged with the British Antarctic Survey again, the Scott Polar Research Institute and others, is to travel from the north of the peninsula down the spine of the peninsula, heading for Union Glacier. So it's a fairly significant distance trip, about 2,000 kilometers in total. But we're beyond the planning stages, the initial planning stages. It's just now is getting the financial backing, getting the science projects, because everything I do now is around science. There's been a sort of pivot change in the way I approach expeditions, which is to go and do something which has benefit to the science and to the planet and to the people, rather than just go and walk down there and say, hey, we've walked this incredible journey. I actually want to come back with something which has value to everybody, so we understand a little bit more about climate change and what's happening on the peninsula, and whether the planet, in terms of change, how it's changing and what the after effects might be.
So you've got that expedition coming up. When exactly is that planned for?
So at the moment, we're looking to go down for the austral summer in the period between 2020 and 2021. Obviously, 2020 is a very important day because it's the 1820 was the first sightings of the Antarctic, so there's a definite connection there. We would really like to celebrate that. We're going at the latter part of that year, but it's still 2020.
And I know that you're also involved in polar survival training.
So we provide, as a result of my background and my naval background, and obviously operating in polar environments, there are lots of different organisations and companies that now go into the maritime environment, into the polar maritime environment, and it's quite different in terms of survival in those conditions than it is when you are abandoning a ship in, I would say, normal sea conditions, maybe the North Sea or the Mediterranean, etc. So we run training for organisations about how best to ensure survival if you are operating in either the Arctic or the Antarctic, and they are actually very, very different environments. So we just make sure that people are fully aware of the differences and what needs to be done to ensure survivability to best effect. There are no guarantees in this business, and there have been instances of ships, going underwater and people having to be abandoned onto the ice and so on. And through a whole series of very fortunate connections, people have been picked up very quickly. But it could have gone entirely the opposite way. So we want to make sure both the ship's teams and the people who travel in those ships have the best chance of survival, especially as the visits into the Arctic and the Antarctic are increasing exponentially.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just thinking. The tourism is growing really fast in both of those regions, and preparation is everything, right? I mean, the more well prepared you are, the better. We never want something bad to happen, but if it does happen, you want to know that anyone who's in control is completely capable of doing the best they possibly can in that environment.
Absolutely. And, it's simple things like being aware, if you're a passenger, that if you jump into Arctic or Antarctic water, where the temperature of the water's 0 or below, you're likely to suffer cold shock, and it will initiate a breathing response if your head goes underwater. Well, if you're not aware of that and you go underwater, you're going to try to breathe. It's highly likely. If you are aware of that and you do there's a simple breathing technique which you can do before you were to enter the water, which will likely prevent you from breathing spontaneously underwater and filling your lungs or your gut full of water with the ramifications that has. So, and there's a whole host of those things which are really valuable to individuals in the event that happens. So we want to make sure that people have the best chance of survival.
The last thing I want to ask you is there anything close to your heart, any project or cause that you want to give a shout out to today and let people know about?
Project run by my friend Anthony Jimman through his community interest company, Education Through Expeditions. We take young people from underprivileged backgrounds, people who are immersed in very difficult circumstance, and we take them up to the Arctic, up to Inari, and we expose them to a completely different world, and it changes them. We've had amazing results with the 3 batches of people we've taken, and it also changes their school friends, because by that communications and their interactive lessons, they are making other children at school aware of a different life, completely different life. For instance, as just a really useful topic, they get to learn to use knives, because if in a survival situation they need to peel the bark off a silver birch and then start a fire, we show them how to do that so they can survive in Arctic conditions. They fish through the ice, so they learn what it's like to actually catch your food. They herd reindeer, they drive dogs, all of these things where they really integrate with the environment. And as I say, they come back as changed characters. And because they're changed, it changes the family dynamic. So their families change as well. And there's an absolute evidence of this. In our first batch of children, we took 10 children out, and none of them were expected to pass their educational exams to go on and to do a higher, like the 11 plus, it's called the 11 plus in the UK, to do a higher schooling system. 6 of them then did. They were motivated through that program to do something different with their lives. And that's the benefit of it. It changes them, it changes their family, and that changes the world.
Yep.
We're really interested in looking for people who want to help fund that.
Excellent. All right. Well, we'll definitely link to that in our show notes, and we'll link to some of the other things that you've mentioned that you're involved in. If anyone wants to further contact you, how is the best way to do that?
My Antarctica Ambassadors website on Facebook.
Excellent. So Antarctic Ambassadors on Facebook, that is where we can find you. Thank you so much for your time and your stories, Paul. This has been amazing, and I suspect it won't be the last time we have you on the podcast.
Okay, I look forward to it, and I'm very grateful for being given the opportunity. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Antarctic Stories. If you like the stories we bring to you, please subscribe for future episodes. And if you want to help the podcast, leaving a rating or review greatly assists us in reaching a wider audience. Antarctic Stories is a production of Twin Tracks Expeditions, your experts in small ship expedition cruises to the Arctic and Antarctica. We love sharing our insider knowledge to help you find the perfect ship for your next polar expedition. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, or at twintracksexpeditions.com.